Okay, let's do Ezra. Yeah, you know, Ezra, the book of Ezra, of course, follows Chronicles, and it follows it chronologically. And so the book of Ezra, we would attribute to Ezra as the author. There's some reason being, as, and of course, in Jewish tradition they identify it, but also there are some autobiographical statements in there that apparently speak in the first person. So if Ezra wasn't written by Ezra in its totality, it was at least based on Ezra's own memoirs. There are some who believe that Ezra and Nehemiah are a single work that was edited by someone. But Nehemiah is clearly Nehemiah's memoirs. Again, it speaks in the first person. So there is some question about that. But the bottom line is this: it's inspired. In Jewish scriptures, Ezra and Nehemiah are put together. And that's why some people think it ought to be put together. But whether it was Ezra or some other prophet who took his memoirs and put it together, it was clearly under inspiration. Its inspiration is never been questioned.
So when you say Jewish scriptures, you're talking about the Hebrew Old Testament.
That's right.
I mean,
yeah.
so it's
really Hebrew Old Testament.
Christian scriptures too.
Yeah, it's ours too. Except we split them up in the English Bible.
Yeah, but that's an English thing.
Yeah.
That's not a Christian.
That's right.
Right?
Right.
Because there would be other languages that have come out of the Hebrew and translated into their other language, and do they split them? Do they follow us?
I don't know if other translations do. I think they follow us. I think we have influenced them.
Okay, because we were first.
Yeah, because we were first, and so their translations are really based on the English division. It's just like we split Kings, Chronicles, and Samuel into two, which they're not split in the Hebrew Bible, but they are in ours, so everyone does it to keep the 66 books of the Bible. What it really works out to.
Children's songs would be totally thrown off.
That's right, yeah. Yeah. Couldn't carry the gospel to the world, lose those children's songs. But now, the chronology of Ezra, I go with Ezra's chronology, but there are some, you'll read some commentaries that question it. And there are some difficulties raised by what year of King who and all this kind of stuff. But they're not insurmountable. They're not big problems. It's just, again, we don't have all the data. And we're trying to make it nice and clean and concise by our standards. And yet, at this time, we don't have all the answers. But it can be harmonized and work. Now, Ezra has a chiastic structure. Ezra does have a chiastic structure, and that's an interesting thing. At the center of it, well, at the beginning, if I were to outline Ezra, the way that I would outline it then, I go a more simple outline, a broad outline, which would be chapters 1 through 6 focuses on rebuilding the temple. And then chapters 7 through 12 focuses on rebuilding the people. Now, some people using Ezra and Nehemiah together see a large chiasm between the two, and this is one of the arguments for the unity of Ezra and Nehemiah, that they're together. Because what you have is in the first, the A portion would be Zerubbabel's return in Ezra 1 and 2. And then parallel to that, opposite to it, at the end of Nehemiah, is Zerubbabel's return and the list of returnees. You got actually two accounts of Zerubbabel's return and two lists, the very beginning and the very end. So they would see these as parallel ideas. Moving in, I guess you say the B and B prime, would be in Ezra, they build the temple and the opposition to building the temple. In Nehemiah, it's the building of the walls and the opposition. It's parallel to each other. And then as you move further in, the C level would be you have the return of Ezra in Ezra 7 and 8, and the return of Nehemiah in Nehemiah 1 and 2. And at the very center of this chiastic structure that they've made would be the purification of the people in Ezra 9 and 10. Now, the problems with this is that you have purification of the people, and reforms also at the end of Nehemiah, which is out of place in a chiasm. Unless you see it as the climax. One of the things that sometimes are done in chiasms is the central point is also repeated at the end because it produces a climax as well as focusing in the middle. So that would be an argument for Ezra and Nehemiah being a single work. And there's some good evidence for that. But again, we, in our Bible, have split it up. But then we split Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and we don't see that as being a problem with inspiration either. So Ezra and Nehemiah may have been done together under inspiration, but we've divided it up for whatever reason. So, key theme of Ezra, I think the dominant theme in Ezra is rebuilding. Both Ezra and Nehemiah focuses on rebuilding of the people and rebuilding of the temple and the walls. They're really the same basic thing. The message of Ezra is God's blessing in response to obedience and national purity enabled the people to rebuild his temple and obey his law to the support of both the kings of Persia and princes of Judah. My message statement for Ezra is way too long. That's the one I still got to work on. Of course, key people in Ezra, Cyrus is a key player because he gets things started. But more importantly, you have, of course, not just Ezra, but who? Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, the direct descendant of David, who should have been king, but now is only a governor. And then also in the book of Ezra, you have a couple of prophets show up. Haggai and Zechariah. And of course, we have their books, the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah. But they ministered during the time of Ezra. And they're critical players in the rebuilding of the temple. God raises them up to motivate the people to rebuild the temple. And really, their prophecies aren't discussed. They're mentioned in Ezra as having had this ministry and encouraging the people, and it talks about the impact because they did finish the temple. But it's only in their writings that you see the significance of everything they said. So that's some fascinating reading. Key events in Ezra would include things like the first return under Zerubbabel, the rebuilding of the temple, of course, and also Ezra's return and reforms. Those are the main focuses of this. Now, here's the interesting thing. What happens between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7? What happens between the return of Zerubbabel and the arrival of Ezra? The book of Esther. The book of Esther. So there's a gap in time here between Zerubbabel's return and Ezra's coming. Why is Ezra able to come? I think in part because of the influence of Esther and Mordecai. But yeah, the story of Esther goes in between. Well, let's work our way through Ezra. Again, first 6 chapters is the issue of the temple. They return under Cyrus's decree, and they're given the instructions to rebuild the temple. They get there, and you have this long genealogical list. And then they arrive, and they start rebuilding the temple. And first thing they do is build the altar and restart sacrifices. Because remember, they can only sacrifice there. So we've been going for 70 years with no sacrifices. Or almost 70 years. Actually, I guess at this point it's about 50 years. It's about 50 years. Because it's going to be 20 some odd years, about 22 years later before they actually finish building the temple. So it's been about 50 years that they haven't had sacrifices. And so they do that, and they celebrate the feast, and they start the worship of God. But a problem develops. Up shows their neighbors who wants to help. Now, why do these guys want to help? Why do they think they're entitled?
Let's say the early Samaritans. They married.
Yeah, they're going to become the Samaritans. Huh?
Their forefathers, some of them were left in the land and were Jewish.
That's right. They're half Jews, half other countries. What become the Samaritans? They've intermarried. These are the ones that the Assyrians brought in, intermixed with the ones they left. They have intermarried. But you remember in Kings it talked about what happened because they were not worshiping Yahweh, that he sent lions and tigers and bears online. And so, you know, and of course the non-native residents kept clicking their heels, but they couldn't get home. So instead, they sent for a priest and to explain to them what to do, and they began worshiping Yahweh along with their own pagan gods. And so God stopped sending the animals to kill them, and instead they then continued this, and they had a perverted worship of God. But they would think they're worshiping the God of Israel. So in their minds, when the Jews return and start building the temple, they do. They think, we got a right to help because we worship the same God. And in fact, we're descendants of his people. We're descendants of Israel. We're half Israelite. So why aren't they allowed to help? Because the leaders make it clear there. Precisely because they are spiritually corrupt. They've committed syncretism. And their worship of God is not worship of God, never will be worship of God. Later on, when Jesus talks to the woman at the well, he tells her, you're still not worshiping God. You know, salvation is of the Jews. You have to worship in Jerusalem. What you're doing on Mount Gerizim is sin. But he rejects it. But that's what you have. So they, of course, want to help. They're told they can't, so then say, well, we can't play, you can't play neither. And so they interfere. And you end up going for 20 years with nothing happening. And then Haggai and Zechariah show up on the scene and say, enough is enough, we've got to clean this up. And God brings them on the scene. Now, Zerubbabel responds to the prophetic testimony by obeying. Now, what's been going on for the last 20 years? They've just been sitting around waiting to build, right?
Settling in, getting comfortable, and
That's right.
marrying the people that are around them.
That's right. They settled in, cleared the fields, started their crops, fixed the vineyards, fixed the walls, rebuilt their houses, made enough money to panel the inside of the houses with cedar. Remember, their houses, they normally just use plaster on the walls. When you can put cedar on the walls, you're rich. In fact, probably some of the houses even had wood floors instead of dirt floors. You're real rich. You know, and they just went about the business of preparing for retirement, you know, having a comfortable life. And so they're condemned for that because they're neglecting God's house because of the pressure. Now, Zerubbabel doesn't push the issue, but when the prophets do push the issue, then he obeys. And in fact, in Haggai and Zechariah, we find out that God is so impressed with him, says he's going to be a signet ring on Messiah's hand. When Jesus comes and sets up his kingdom, Zerubbabel is going to be in charge of the new temple. I mean, God's very impressed with what he did. Why is it so impressive that Zerubbabel would then finish building the temple? Well, let's think about this.
Yeah, a lot of opposition.
Yeah, he's got a lot of opposition. And here's one of the problems. His opposition live in walled cities. How many walled cities do they have in Judea? Zip. Yeah, that's about it. What kind of a defense can you set up if you don't have a walled city from which to fight? You can't. You can fight a guerrilla warfare, I guess. But see, Zerubbabel was a practical man. He's the governor. And I think probably a part of the problem is this. He loves the people. But he has to balance out what can I do and what is safe. And if these guys are going to attack, they're helpless. Because the time it would take to send back to Nineveh to get help. Not Nineveh, I mean Babylon. Yeah, back to Babylon, where the Persian king is located, or Susa, where the Persian king is located, or wherever his headquarters is, to get all the way back there, convince them to send help, gather up an army, equip them, and then march back. You're talking 9 to 10 months.
Yeah, that'd be 600 miles, wouldn't it?
Yeah. On foot. Or, at best on camel. Yeah, you're not going to be around by the time help comes. If you have a walled city, you can hold out till the cavalry arrives. But if you don't have a walled city, there ain't nothing left. So practically, there's nothing he can do. So, lest we condemn him. But, so when he makes the decision to do it, it's a real act of courage and trusting God. Now, God helps him. How? We have this account of these series of letters that goes back and forth. And they discover the command, and they send back and say, not only are you to leave him alone, give him anything he needs. God turns the table on them. And they are able to build it. Now, when they dedicate it, is it a beautiful structure? It's very plain. And some of the older people there remember what Solomon's temple was, and they're not, they're horrified in a sense. I mean, they're heartbroken. And yet, when you read, again, in Haggai, God's response was, don't feel bad about it. I'm pleased, and that's what counts. Why is God pleased? Because they were obedient. And he said, I'm going to make it glorious, not you. Yeah. Herod the Great tried to fix it. He built his temple over top of the old one and then pulled it out once it was done. And he made one of the wonders of the world. It was a beautiful temple. But it's nothing in comparison to the temple that Messiah is going to build when he returns. And when the glory of God is actually in it. Now, the second half of Ezra is Ezra's return himself. Ezra's return and him and his reforms. Now, Artaxerxes makes Ezra governor and sends him back. Probably Zerubbabel has gotten sick and died. Ezra requests this. Now let's ask this question. Who is Artaxerxes? Well,
He's king.
Well, he's the king. But who is he in history? Artaxerxes is the son of Ahasuerus, who was known in the Greek world as Xerxes. In your Greek history, Xerxes, the Persian king, is Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. And in fact, when we get to Esther, I'll point this out, that the famous war against the Greeks that the Persians lost was between Esther chapter 1 and 2. This is the Xerxes who tried to conquer Greece with a 1,000,000-man army and failed because the Spartans had gotten away. But Artaxerxes is his son. He was known as Artaxerxes Longimanus, not because he had long hair, a long mane, but because he had long fingers. That's what Longimanus meant, long fingers. He would have been a great pianist.
But isn't he actually gives the decree in 445 to go back and rebuild the walls and the trench?
Uh-huh. Yes.
Okay.
He's going to be the one to do it. But Artaxerxes, his dad, Ahasuerus, Xerxes, was a drunk and basically drank himself into oblivion. That's why Esther invites him to drinking parties, because he liked his wine. And he was an alcoholic, most likely. And Artaxerxes, I guess, got tired of waiting for the throne and assassinated his dad and took over. And growing up with him was a young Israelite boy, a young Jewish boy named Nehemiah, who was his servant and became his prime minister, his cupbearer. And of course, is going to be the second half of this, Ezra and Nehemiah. So this is the time chronologically where things are. Now, Artaxerxes sends them back, and of course, this is in 7 is where we learned that Ezra devoted his life to what? The study and the teaching of the Scriptures. And he goes back to do that. Now, they safely return, and I find this an interesting thing. In Ezra, they don't ask for a military escort because they've told the king that God will take care of us, and God does, because they're carrying a lot of treasure with them, as well as people. But I think they're also a pretty big group. But he gets there, and God blesses their return, and he sees a problem. And what's the problem?
No Levites.
Yeah, well, that's before his return. No Levites, so they gather up some Levites. But after they get back, and he's ready to teach God's word, what's the problem we got there?
Oh, you're talking about all the intermarriage?
Yeah, intermarriage with pagans. They're making the same mistake Israel made their first time in the land. They intermarried with the Canaanites. Now they're intermarrying with these spiritually defiled people. Now, here's the thing to understand again. It's not a racial issue. It's not even a cultural issue, because they are Israelites. They're half Jew, half Israelite, so they're their relatives. It's a spiritual issue. Again, not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. It's a spiritual issue. And he's appalled. Now, how does he handle the situation?
He tells them to put them away. Put them on.
Actually, before he does that, what does he do? He falls down and starts crying. He's emotionally horrified. And they are horrified that he's horrified. And then tells them, here's a solution. Now, he is able to affect change because apparently, even as their governor, he can influence them by his personality. We're told in 1 Peter that elders of the church are supposed to lead by example, not by dominating, but by being an example, modeling the Christian life, rather than being a dictator. And Ezra, I think, was someone who modeled devotion to the Lord. And so when he is horrified at this sin, people become aware of the fact that, hey, this is not good. And so they solve the problem by dissolving the marriages. Now, does that raise any kind of interesting problems here? What does God's view on divorce? He doesn't like it. But he approved of this. He approved of this. Why would he approve of it? Actually, it's interesting. It doesn't really say God approved. It just says they did it. Okay. We need to be careful here. Sometimes the Bible reports what happened without telling you it's good or bad. And this is one of those things that's descriptive, not prescriptive. Because in fact, we know from New Testament revelation, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, if you're married to a non-believer and they consent to live with you, don't divorce them just because they're a non-believer. Yeah, that's right. If they divorce you, then you're free. So he makes a distinction there. Here, they're putting them away. And in fact, it's a euphemism for divorce. It wasn't just packing them up and moving them to a new location. They're packing them up and sending them home. Mom and kids, which means the kids are losing their citizenship. I mean, it's a complete house cleaning. But it was a necessary thing. Did it last long? No, because Nehemiah's going to have to deal with it again. Did the Jews ever learn their lesson on that?
No.
I think in the end you find, after the Maccabean period, after the intertestamental period, when the Greek overlords tried to force them to intermarry, that they finally became, but they became that ethnocentric group that we see in the New Testament, almost a Zionist group. But it was through the school of hard knocks. And what they learned in the intertestamental period is the only way to stay spiritually pure is to stay culturally pure, which means to stay ethnically pure, because whenever you intermarry, you bring in these gods. And so the only way to keep them out is to keep them out. And so they became this ethnically pure group. They focused on that. But remember, in Judaism, it's not a racial issue still. It's always been a spiritual issue because anybody could proselytize and become a Jew. Which is why you had Ethiopian Jews, you got Chinese Jews, you got European Jews, and you've got Semite Jews, Semitic Jews, original Jews, everything. So you got all kinds of groups because you can and you join whichever tribe you want to join. So you can have someone who's black in the tribe of Simeon because it was open. So, but it is a spiritual issue, and Ezra is a part of that. So the book of Ezra focuses on the fact that God is rebuilding the nation. And He rebuilds it first through the governor Zerubbabel, who's a godly man, in the rebuilding of the temple to establish the worship, like the issue in Chronicles. But even then, the worship can't be correct or complete because of this intermarriage, so he sends Ezra to solve that problem. So he sent Zerubbabel to build the temple and Ezra to build the people. But ultimately, it's not just having a temple. It's still living in obedience to the Lord. And obedience meant keeping oneself unstained by the world. Paul tells us what? Pure religion is what? Helping widows and orphans in their distress and keeping oneself unstained by the world. That's what true religion is from God's perspective. In other words, bringing justice and mercy to the helpless and not being a part of a rebellious, sinful world system. And so Ezra, in his understanding of the law, sought to bring that. Now, the book of Nehemiah, we're going to see Ezra's influence. That's some more. Because Nehemiah, he's still on the scene when Nehemiah arrives and takes over the governorship. And who knows, maybe he was governor when Nehemiah arrived. We're not told who was the governor at that point. But Nehemiah's going to come and take over. But Ezra got that opportunity to restore the people. But we see it's through influence. But God is working to restore a nation. But the nation has to be restored spiritually. But that restoration is measured in the level of obedience. And that's true for us. The real measure of our spiritual life, of our sanctification, is our obedience. And Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. If we're devoted to Him, we'll be obedient. And the more devoted, the more obedient. None of us are fully devoted because we all still have sin natures. But we have to be careful to keep ourselves unstained and unentangled in the world. And that was the thing that God was rescuing Judah from as they were rebuilding themselves. Well, that's all I have for tonight. I appreciate your attentiveness. Y'all.
Where do you think Cyrus was?